This series is presented by the National Dropout Prevention Center, a division of SPN, the Successful Practices Network. The pandemic's impact on at-risk students, schools, and learning was presented live to the South Carolina Department of Education by Dr. Sandy Addis, the chairman of the National Dropout Prevention Center, on his recent publication co-authored by Ray McNulty with an introduction from Dr. Bill Daggett.
The impact of pandemic school closure on students, educators, schools, districts, and communities is likely to be the greatest education challenge of our lifetime. Think about that for a minute. When has there been in your career a greater disruption of school than we've just experienced? It's been horrendous, and it's had far-reaching impact on us as educators, on our kids, our school districts, our schools, our structures. And so we want to look at that topic today and think for a minute about how this has impacted us and what do we need to know and do, and particularly do differently, particularly as we go back to school. Think about this progression of sequence of events for just a moment. Could this happen to your school district? What if here this year, 2021-22, what if the pandemic shutdown produces a wave of more at-risk students? They're trauma impacted, failing grades, lost students, home disruption, that type of thing. And what if in the next 2 or 3 years, 2022, 2024, what if there's increased numbers of at-risk students that need various programs and services and alternative placements to recover from the damage that they've experienced and then to graduate? What if there's increased need? And what if our alternative programs and our services in our schools are unable to accommodate and graduate this increased number of students? If those things happen in a sequence similar to that, we can expect in 2024 and beyond significant multi-year declines in graduation rates. And that could be terrible for our schools, for our communities, and for the state of South Carolina. This can be a huge problem for us. And we're predicting that if we don't get ahead of it, it's going to be. Our students have experienced more and more risk factors during the pandemic shutdown. At the National Dropout Prevention Center, we often talk about risk factors. Risk factors being those things in a student's life and in their school and their personal life that place them at risk. And we know that from our research that the more risk factors a student has in their life and the more severe those risk factors are, then the less likely they are to succeed and graduate. And we know that during the pandemic shutdown, our students experienced more risk factors, such as increased poverty. We know that many of our families, particularly early on in the layoffs and the shutdowns and all the dishevelment and the confusion that our economy experienced in March through the summer of 2020, we know that there was increased poverty. We know that some of our children who didn't live in poverty went into poverty, and some of our children whose families were already in poverty sank to deeper levels of poverty. And poverty is a definite risk factor. We know that our children experienced more fears and uncertainty. They experienced uncertainty of not going to school, the uncertainty of when do I go to school? How do I go to school? Do I go on alternate days? We've even got school districts in parts of this country right now that are debating whether to open school 2 weeks from now. And the kids are sitting at home thinking, well, what's going to happen? What do I do? Their routines have been totally disrupted. And many of our kids lived in fear because many of them had to isolate in some pretty tough circumstances and hunker down in some very cramped and confined home situations. And they had to stay with family members that some may have been dysfunctional. They couldn't get out and get away from them. And so kids have experienced a lot of this as we've gone through the last several months. We know that we've had more family dysfunction. We know already, both from anecdotal reports and from preliminary data, we know that a lot of families were damaged by the pandemic. Somebody died, somebody got sick, there was fear, there was loss of income, there was uncertainty of housing, uncertainty of where are we going to be, what are we going to do? And so this all impacted kids, and they experienced this. We also know that there was increased abuse. We know that many of the agencies that handle child abuse reports said that they had fewer reports, but yet the anecdotal information indicates that there was more abuse going on out in the homes. And this is probably because many of the reports of abuse came from schools, and schools were closed. And so the stressors in the households were greater. The capacity of school personnel to make the reports was less. And so our children have experienced increased risk factors and more powerful risk factors in their lives. And we can't ignore that. I'd like to take a minute just to show you an example here. This was an example from, this was a headline from WLOS News in Asheville, North Carolina. Silva man charged with child abuse after incident captured during online class. And here was the text of the report. Silva police say the incident took place August the 19th during a remote learning session involving a 13-year-old child. Silva police say that a recorded class, like a Zoom meeting probably, shows the girl at home and a man wrapping his arms around the child's jawline and squeezing tightly. After a few seconds, the child is released and begin to cry. Then they say she was struck in the head. Now, if something like this happens during a Zoom class, that a teacher is recording and some adult who should have known better, should have known that they were being watched. If it's happening there, think of what may have been happening in other settings, other places, other times for these kids. So we know that things have been pretty tough for these kids.